you should feel free to
say whatever I want, huh?
Yeah, and take off if something strikes you. And then I can always move you over a little bit more. Okay, we ready? Okay. All right. Talk about your early years growing up in Evansville, what that was like, and some of your influences in those times.
Well, my early years in Evansville began when I was an 8th grader at the Wheeler School, elementary school in Evansville. And from there I went to Central Evansville High School. My whole life at that time centered around basketball. If you or anyone saw the movie Hoosiers, then you know what my life was like in Indiana at that time. Basketball was the center of my world.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. You're kind of okay. Okay. Hoosiers presents sort of an idealized portrayal of sort of coming of age. Is that how you remember it? I mean, that basketball was sort of the center of the community, and people kind of came together. It was a sort of a community magnet for the whole community.
Basketball really was the center of the community in many ways. This was before the NCAA took off. It was right after the war. The NBA, if it was in existence, was barely in existence. And so the whole focus of a community like Evansville, Indiana, was on the high school basketball teams. And I had the very great good fortune of having good coaches in the 8th grade and the 9th, all the way up through high school, who had a profound impact, I think, on my life. But the center of it was always being the best we could be in basketball and aiming for the state championship.
And in fact, you went to the state championship. I remember in Hoosiers how in awe the players were when they walked into the field house. Was that the way it was with you?
Well, I had that experience. I played twice in the state finals. Once we were eliminated at the semifinals in the final game in Bloomington. Then my senior year in high school, we went all the way to the state finals, all the way to the final game. And we were beat by Jeff of Lafayette, a team that we had beaten fairly easily, actually, during the season. But I was injured in the afternoon game against Muncie Central. We won that game. But I tore a cartilage in my knee and spent the entire time between the afternoon and the night game on a orthopedic bench in the bowels of the Butler Fieldhouse while they tried to get my knee in shape for the night game. I started the night game, didn't play very long, the cartilage popped out again, and that was the end for me.
And then you went on to college where?
I went to Greencastle, Indiana, DePauw University, spent 4 years there.
Did you play basketball there?
I did. I spent 4 years as a varsity player in DePauw. We had some very good teams then for a small college, and I continued my interest in basketball. But during those years, my interest began to decline, and I fortunately started thinking about some other things.
Including?
Well, including what I'd do. To this day, one of my very vivid memories is walking across the stage to receive my degree from DePauw University and not having the slightest idea what I wanted to do, and being a bit jealous, really, of my peers who seemed to have a much more directed, well-directed life than I did. So I left DePauw University, studied abroad for a year in Germany, really basically traveled across Europe, and then returned to law school in Bloomington.
And then I guess you spent some time in Chicago and then wound up in Columbus?
That's correct. I graduated from Indiana University Law School, and the first job I took as a new lawyer was in Chicago, Illinois. practiced law there for a couple of years, decided that I really wanted to come back to Indiana, and I began to understand that I probably wanted to do something other than practice law. I got the very uneasy feeling while I was practicing law in Chicago that I was working for about 0.5% of the American people in terms of wealth, the very top 0.5%. I really wasn't comfortable with that. Went back to Columbus, Indiana, enjoyed the practice of law much more there, but when I was in Columbus, I began to be attracted to politics.
And you got involved in the Kennedy for President campaign?
My very first involvement in politics was to head up in Bartholomew County the Citizens for Kennedy group. And that was a group with a lot of touring celebrities. The biggest one probably Stan Musial, the Cardinal baseball player, all-time great, but also including Ethel Kennedy and Angie Dickinson, a movie star, Jeff Chandler, a movie star, Arthur Schlesinger, Byron Whizzer White, who later went on to the Supreme Court. And we had a big rally, maybe 2 or 3 of them in southern Indiana.
What about, that was an era of idealism that was spurred in large part because of the Kennedys. What influence did that have on your own thinking?
Kennedy played an interesting role in my political life. I was practicing law in Columbus in the winter of 1960 when I got a telephone call from a friend and said, would I host a coffee for a senator from Massachusetts who was running for president, John Kennedy. I said that I would. I didn't know much about Senator Kennedy. I invited every friend I had to see him. He came to Columbus, Indiana on a cold, blustery day, and I called up every friend I had in the state, and we had 35 people, I think, come out to see Senator Kennedy. And I've always been amused by it because here's the most charismatic politician of my generation. I couldn't get any interest in him. And I didn't see him much after that, only one time, I think, but Ted Sorensen came with him. And Ted and I have become good friends, and he often kids me that that was the worst event that Senator Kennedy ever had on his march to the White House. Senator Kennedy came, incidentally, to that meeting, had laryngitis, and he could not speak. And he passed out a little card that said, my name is John F. Kennedy, I'm running for president, I'd appreciate your vote. And then Ted Sorensen gave a speech for him.
So then, in '62, you worked for Birch Bayh. How did you become involved with Birch Bayh? Well, when did your friendship with Birch Bayh begin?
Birch and I became friends in 1952. He was president of his fraternity, Alpha Tau Omega, at Purdue University. I was president of the chapter at Greencastle. And our first acquaintance was when we went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for a conference of fraternity officers. We had several common friends in the fraternity. So I met Birch and, like everybody else, liked him. And when he decided that he would make a political career, I was strongly in his corner. And in 1962, when he ran for the Senate, I was the chairman for him in Bartholomew County, which was a Republican county, a tough county for him to win. I tried to help as much as I could. I don't think we carried the county, but in an amazing race, as every Democrat in Indiana knows, he won in 1962.
That race was almost a political version of Hoosiers. How did that victory impact that campaign, and then the victory impact on your own thinking about public service, whether or not you would?
Well, I think it was an important point for me.
Say what I'm not going to be on.
Yeah, okay. I think the 1962 experience I had in supporting Senator Bayh had quite an impact on me, probably more than I realized at the time. I greatly admired Birch. I thought he was a terrific campaigner and would be a wonderful senator. Wanted to help him in every way that I could. But as I got involved in that process, I found out that I kind of liked it. And unlike a lot of young people, I did not go through law school, didn't go through college thinking I'd be a politician. I kind of eased into it in those crucial years from 1959 through 1964. And Birch was a major influence there on me. And then after 1962, he went into the United States Senate. I was thrilled with his victory. And I decided, well, maybe I'd like to try running for Congress too. We had a long-term Republican congressman there, Earl Wilson from Bedford, Indiana. I knew very little about politics. I didn't know much about winning an election, but I decided I'd give it a crack.
So how did you approach that campaign?
Well, I approached it with a lot of energy, not much money. But in those days, you could win campaigns by shoe leather. And we had all of the counties of southeastern Indiana, small counties, rural counties. Television was not a big thing. And I just put tremendous energy into it, beginning in the summer of 1963, maybe the spring of 1963. And I had a lot of good help. Wayne Vance was one of them, of course. Tom Feddick, who later became postmaster in Seymour, was a big help to me. David McFall, and many, many others helped me. But probably the key player for me was Dick Stoner. Dick Stoner was the 9th District Chairman, a high executive at Cummins Engine Company, and he really introduced me to the world of not only big-time state politics, but Washington politics. And we came up here, for example, to Washington to see Larry O'Brien, who was one of the great names of Democratic politics at that time. Became Postmaster General under President Kennedy.
Were you able to run any kind of radio advertising or do any kind of mailing?
I ran some radio advertising, some newspaper advertising, no television. We had a budget of $30,000, and we were able to get elected on it. Now, there's one big factor I had going for me, and that was 1964. I had no idea what kind of a year it would be. This is just sheer luck on my part. 64 turned out to be the best Democratic year, I think, in the last century. And if it had not been for Lyndon Johnson, I would never have gone to the United States Congress. I often look back at that with some amusement because I really didn't have any idea that we were headed for a Democratic landslide, but we did have one.
Now, the Congress that you entered in 1965, that was a Congress where there was a lot of exciting and extraordinary issues on the table. The Voting Rights Act and the entire Johnson agenda, Great Society and so forth. How did you, was that, tell me, was that an exciting time for you?
Oh, that's one of the most exciting times in my political life, and curiously, I didn't really know it. I mean, I just thought every
restate
okay. Well, surely one of the most exciting times in my political life is when I went into the Congress in 1965. I didn't even realize what an exceptional time it was. All through the campaign, I had debated things like Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education, the poverty program, and all the rest, the things that Lyndon Johnson was running on in 1964. I went into the Congress in 1965. Johnson had, in effect, an agenda at that time. And so in the early days of the Johnson administration, we passed all of that legislation. And most of it, I may say, is still on the books, altered in some ways, but fundamentally still there. Medicaid, Medicare, federal aid to education, and all of the rest. It was a terribly exciting time to be in the Congress. And interestingly enough, the public esteem of the Congress at that time was very high. People felt we were making progress for the country, and I believe we did.
Talk a little bit about the diversity of the job, Congressman. You did, over your 34 years, did everything from meet with heads of state to do 3-4 town hall meetings in a day.
Yeah.
It's kind of an unusual combination for a job to be that diverse, meet with so many different types of people. Talk a little bit about that.
I think one of the most wonderful things about the job of a congressman is that it puts you in touch with every level of society. You meet with heads of state, prime ministers, foreign ministers. At the same time, you tour all kinds of facilities and housing projects where you meet people at the lower end, at least in an economic sense, of society. And you have to learn to be at home with all of them, and you have to learn to like all of them, and to benefit from your experience with all of these people, not be awed by the king or the prime minister, and not feel in any way arrogant or superior to the person who is at the lower end of the economic ladder. One of the great privileges of politics is that you run into people all across the spectrum. And if you don't like meeting people all across the spectrum, then you probably better not be in politics.
How did you go about making your own mark in those early years? How did you see yourself fit into that Congress? There was some real, looking back at it, historical giants in that Congress. How did you try to make your mark?
I think in the early days of the Congress, and this is a very different day back then, it was recognized, excuse me, I think in the early days of the Congress, it was a very different Congress back then. You recognized that new members of Congress were not accepted immediately. You had to earn your place at the table. And so I focused on my district, like a lot of my members do and should. I tried to become a good representative of the people I represented, to try to do a lot for their communities, to do a lot for their the individual requests that came to me. But all of the time, I recognized that it was important for me to master my brief, to understand the legislation that was moving through the committees that I served on, and to be recognized within that committee as a person who knew what they were talking about. And so I didn't try to be an outside player. I didn't try to get on the evening news. I didn't try to get into the talk shows. I focused on Indiana, and I focused on mastering the brief. And I really kept that up for maybe 10 years or so, and then only gradually moved into the national or even the international scene.
What, looking back, what areas of your job as congressman do you think you were most passionate about? What's really kind of drove you, gave you satisfaction?
I think one of the things that gave me the greatest satisfaction in the Congress was seeing communities enhance the quality of life in those communities because of things I had done. Help bring a library to a community, help bring a water system to a community, help improve the quality of care at the local hospital, build a road or a highway or a bridge, or do 1,001 things that every member of the Congress does. I got a lot of satisfaction out of that. On the legislative side, I was not on one of the major legislative committees of the Congress producing tax legislation or on the Appropriations Committee, but I found an immense amount of satisfaction in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I enjoyed that work, and I think I began to make a contribution towards it. I had a fascinating experience when Speaker Carl Albert came to me one day and offered me a position on the Ways and Means Committee. And I said I wanted to think about it. And I came back the next day and I turned it down. And he said to me initially, he said, "Lee, that's an unusual decision. I've never had any member of the Congress turn down a seat on the House Ways and Means Committee." And then a week or two later, in good humor, he came to me and he said, "Lee, you must be the dumbest man in the United States Congress because you didn't take that seat." Well, I didn't. And I didn't because if you look at it in terms of power, it was a dumb move. You have a lot more power on the Ways and Means Committee. But to me, it's a matter of interest at that point, and I stayed with Foreign Affairs.
You served under several speakers during your tenure. Do any of those speakers of the House stand out, or is there anything you'd like to talk about any of them or all of them?
Well, they all had their own strengths in their own different ways. I came in under Speaker McCormick. I was really kind of stood in awe of McCormick, a great debater, a slashing debater. Didn't really know me for the first few terms I was there. That was kind of the tradition in those days. So I was never a close friend or intimate of John McCormick, but I had a lot of respect for him. Tip O'Neill was one of these remarkable personalities in American politics. I don't think anybody I ever knew disliked Tip O'Neill. He was Irish Catholic politician, enormously popular in the Congress. And he called me Neil Hamilton for the first 5 or 6 years that I was there, because he had known a baseball player in Boston by the name of Neil Hamilton, and that kind of stuck in his mind. I remember taking a group of constituents in to see him one time, and he put his arm around me in that very affable way of his and said, "I want to tell you folks that your Congressman Neil Hamilton's one of the finest in the country." Well, I don't think that impressed my constituents very much. But he was a very great political leader. Jim Wright, Tom Foley, all of them had their strengths. And of course, Tom and I are very close friends because we came in together.
What do you talked about some of the things that gave you satisfaction, and we talked about bringing various things to the district. Is there any one thing that sort of stands out for you that you were able to do for a community or for an individual that
No, I don't think any one project or any one thing that I did really stands out in my mind. In part because of the district I represented. I represented usually over 21 counties, so I was not in one community. I was really a part of many different communities, and I tried to help them all. I don't have a single project that stands out in my mind. I don't have a single piece of legislation that stands out in my mind. In looking back on it, I think the votes that gave me the greatest satisfaction personally were probably the votes I cast when I was first serving, the Medicare votes. And I've often said to myself, for example, what vote did I cast after that had a more profound impact on the quality of life of people than voting for Medicare and or aid to education? Those were very significant votes, and at the time, very controversial votes. I took a lot of effort to defend those votes back in Indiana.
How has the role of Congress changed, and how has Congress changed since you entered in 1965?
Although the Congress has changed in innumerable ways. One way that I think stands out in my mind is that the current Congress is too timid. I do not think you can argue today that the Congress of the United States is a co-equal branch of government. It is not. The executive dominates, and if you talk to President Bush or Vice President Cheney, they're proud of the fact that they have reasserted the powers of the executive branch. I believe our system works best when you really do have co-equal branches of government. And so over a period of years, I would say, I've seen a drift of power towards the executive branch of government. I personally do not view that as an altogether good thing. I don't argue for a weak president. You have to have a strong president. But I also think in order to make our system work, you have to have a strong Congress.
Well, and how does that change? I mean, to make them co-equals again, what do you think needs to happen?
Well, the Congress has to assert its constitutional power. Let's talk about it in two ways very quickly. One is Congress shall have the power to declare war. That sentence in the Constitution today is a nullity. Presidents take us to war now, not Congress. Congress may come in and supply some money afterwards, but that's when the troops are already in the field. So Congress needs to reassert itself in foreign affairs, in the war-making decision, the gravest decision that government makes. Congress ought to be involved in it. Even on the question of the power of the purse, which most people will say this is the power of the Congress, but budgets today are principally put together by the president, and when the president sends that budget to the Congress overwhelmingly approves it. 90 to 95% of the president's budget is always approved, even when members of Congress are saying it's dead on arrival, which is not the case at all. The real debates with regard to the budget today take place in the Office of Management and Budget, and not so much in the Congress. So on these two powers, the power to go to war, the power of the purse, I think the Congress has ceded altogether too much power to the executive branch.
Do you think it would require institutional changes, or is this just a change, or is this a leadership issue, primarily a leadership issue?
I think you return to what I would call the regular order. That is to go back the way we did it. Instead of having an omnibus bill where you throw everything into a single bill that is not marked so much by the number of pages, but the sheer weight of it, where you'll have 15,000, 20,000 provisions in a single bill, appropriation bills, you go back to the system you once had of considering an appropriation bill for each department of government, basically. In other words, return to the regular order so that every member of Congress can offer amendments on the floor of the House on an appropriation bill, which they can't do most of the time today. Likewise, with regard to the decision to go to war, Congress must participate in that as an equal partner, not as a subservient partner, as an equal partner of the president.
You've served under, what, 8 presidents?
I think we've served under 7 or 8. I'm not sure. I have to count them.
Can you give me some of your impressions of some of them, beginning with Johnson?
Well, I have impressions, of course, and distinct memories of all of them. Johnson was the master politician. He came into office with very unusual circumstances, the death of President Kennedy, but the most important thing in many respects was he had an agenda. He had a mandate, a very clear electoral mandate, enact these programs that became the Great Society. So he, without a peer, was the most effective president in getting his legislative program adopted. No president since Johnson has had that kind of a record. Okay.
She's a hardcore Democrat. She's
That's good.
Forward to doing some work for Barron.
That's good. That's good.
All right, we ready? We're back. Some of the other presidents that were there, do you want to?
Jerry Ford was one I may have known best because I worked with him in the House. A very likable man. Kind of backed into the presidency in a way. Appointed in almost as vice president and then became president, but a very fine person and very likable. But I've known all the presidents pretty well and have appreciated their strengths in different ways. No one masters the office. It's too tough a job.
Some of them obviously called on you from time to time for counsel or, to run things by. Who would probably, other than Jerry Ford, who would be maybe the president that you spoke to most?
I don't know that I remember speaking to the presidents more one than the other. I always felt I had access to the president if I wanted to see them, Republican or Democrat. And I would take advantage of that only sparingly. But I came to appreciate the burden of the presidency and how tough the job really is. And I think that tempered my view in terms of politics a good bit. This is a very difficult country to govern. It's a very big, complicated country. Back in the late 1940s, when I was in high school, we had 130 million people in the country. Today we've got whatever it is, close to 300 million. So the country's become a lot bigger and a lot more complicated. And presidents are right at the center of it. And I think they feel perhaps more than most Americans some of the centrifugal forces, if you will, that operate in this country, and how difficult it is to work together and solve our problems. And I came to appreciate some of the difficulties a president confronts.
In your years in Congress and after that, you witnessed some dramatic historical events, the Vietnam War, Watergate, fall of the Berlin Wall. Can you give me your impressions about some of these sort of world historical or national historical events and what impact they might have had on the country?
One of the things I think you feel when you're a member of Congress is that you may not be all that powerful, but you're at least a bit player in some of these dramatic events, and you certainly have a ringside seat at them. And I did, through Watergate, through Iran-Contra, through the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Middle East peace process again and again and again, and of course the impeachment proceedings against President Clinton, the downfall of Richard Nixon and Watergate. All of these things have quite a profound impact. I always felt that I had a ringside seat and that I was watching history, even a bit player in some respects. But it was a great privilege, and I think the satisfaction that occurs is that you feel that you're contributing in a small, very, very small way to the direction and the success of your country.
You addressed how the role of Congress has changed over the years. How has the role of politics changed? You mentioned when you ran, you spent $30,000. The last time you ran, it was more than 30, I'm sure.
Well, I spent $30,000 the first time I ran. I spent well over $1 million the last time I ran. But I think the thing that really impresses me about politics and the way it's changed is not just the money, that's a big factor, but it's the intensity of the game. Interest groups are so much more prominent. They're so much more sophisticated. They bear down so much harder. They know how to manipulate the levers of power, and there are many more of them. For example, let's take agriculture. When I went into the Congress, you had 2 or 3 or 4 agricultural groups in the nation. Today, you've got an agricultural group for every commodity you can name. I can remember being visited by the people who produce the nut products in Hawaii, for example. So you have more groups, you have more people, you have more sophisticated people, you have a lot more money, and you have a lot more attention focused on the Congress and on the country. So you get the sense much more now than when I went in that you're right in the middle of a boiling pot, if you would.
Did you take a poll during the first campaign?
I don't think we had the money to take a poll in my first campaign.
And I want to get back to that. You ran against a long-term incumbent, Earl Wilson. How did you get your message out? Did you have debate? Would he debate you? Did he have debates, or was it just through news releases?
We got our message out through personal appearances, through radio, through news releases, not through television, but really from just shoe leather.
What was your message back then?
Well, the message was clear. We needed a change, I thought. But I also had the advantage, and I didn't really realize this at the time, that I was running on a platform. Not a platform I had put together, but a platform that existed. Medicare. A lot of people opposed that. Federal aid to education. A lot of people opposed that. The war on poverty. Much opposition to that. All of these things, which were part of the Democratic platform in 1964, became my platform. And so I had sometimes debates, not always with my opponent, sometimes with people locally who were speaking up for opposition to these. For example, I remember going before the doctors and in a number of communities and arguing for Medicare. The doctors were all opposed to it, and they would choose someone from their community to debate that with me. And I had that experience several times. The what?
That's your falling out.
Okay.
You did
Yep.
good. You look great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're viewed as someone who's, in a sense, above partisan politics by many people, and yet you're a passionate Democrat. How do you pull that off? Most politicians can't pull that off, but maybe more importantly, how do you see the difference? It's not something you see very often these days.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the role of politics and that commitment to democratic principles versus at times being nonpartisan?
I think you have to work at appealing across the aisle in politics in order to be effective, and I tried very hard to do that. I would take a position on all kinds of issues, but I would try very hard to articulate it in such a way that may not persuade the opposite point of view, but at least did not inflame them or irritate them. And the way in which you do things makes a huge difference. I was reading just the other day some of the speeches and state papers of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War period. And one of the things that I noticed about him was the very carefully crafted language, which did not inflame the Southerners or the South. Well, I didn't know about that when I was in Congress, but I often found myself crafting language. The other thing that would have some appeal, but the other thing, and I think fundamentally, is that you have to respect your peers in politics. You have to always remember that they were elected by the same number of people that elected you. And you approach your business knowing that you have to have a fundamental respect for the other side, and knowing that although on issue number one, you may be at odds with them, on issue number 2 and 3, you're going to be joined together. In other words, you're constantly building coalitions in politics. No one in the Congress is a permanent friend or a permanent enemy. It's a shifting coalition.
But it does seem, at least on the face, that there is less of your kind of approach these days than maybe there was in an earlier time. Do you agree with that?
I do. I think politics today has taken on a very sharp partisan edge. I think for many reasons. The media is partially to blame because they always want positions stated in the extreme. They don't want the middle position. The way in which we elect members has a profound impact here. Very few contested seats in the Congress anymore. What that means is you elect Republicans who tend to be more conservative, Democrats who tend to be more liberal, And the great question in American politics today is what's happened to the center. The center has kind of collapsed, and it is a serious fault, I think, in our politics.
I want to get back to sort of the day-to-day work of a congressman. What was it like having to come back virtually every weekend? And I'm sure you enjoyed interacting, but to talk a little bit about sort of the I don't know, sort of the intensity of the job.
I would make 40 trips back home a year from Washington to Indiana. And amazingly enough, throughout most of my career, I didn't really think about it all that much. We'd finish work Thursday night or Friday, and I'd go down to the National Airport in Washington, hop on an airplane, go to Indiana, work Friday, Saturday, try to come back sometime on Sunday. And I did that again and again and again, 40 times a year, 35 times a year for 34 years. Towards the end of my career, I began to think more about it, and it's harder and harder for me to drag myself to the airport every weekend to put in another week's work. It's a tough grind. You spend all week in Washington working very, very hard. Then you get on that airplane, you go back to Indiana, and you work hard again, and then you go back to Washington and start a new week without any much of a break. You can't do that unless you have very good physical health, unless you have a lot of energy, and unless you like your job. And I was blessed with very good health, a lot of energy, and I really enjoyed being in Washington. I enjoyed being in Indiana. I didn't enjoy going back and forth.
You were also marched in a lot of parades.
I've been in more parades than any living American. I'm reasonably confident of that. Most of them, we had more people in the parade than were watching the parade because they occurred in the small towns in Indiana. But I'm the world's leading expert on parades, I believe.
And then town hall meetings, sometimes as many as 3 or more on a Saturday.
Yes, I'd schedule a lot of public meetings. No public meeting would run an hour, and then I'd usually allow 15, 20 minutes to get to the next town and do 3 or 4 in a row. If you do that, it's a little takes a little energy out of you.
Any stories come to mind about any of that?
Well, an amazing thing to me is that I can scarcely remember any Hoosier really getting mad at me, angry. I can remember a lot of times they disagreed with me, but I was amazingly well received, and I can think, I guess, of a couple of times when people were really angry, but very, very seldom. And I think that's kind of a tribute to Hoosiers because they treat people respectfully and civilly.
We touched on this a little bit. You entered politics and public life in an era of idealism. And now it seems more of a time of cynicism. What do you think needs to be done to get more of that idealistic spirit back in the public arena?
I'm not pessimistic about that. I think there are rhythms to American life, patterns to it, and I think we wax and wane. Right now we're in a period of high partisanship. That won't last forever. The reason it won't last forever is because members of Congress are pretty good politicians, and they know what their constituents want. And if their constituents say to them, look, we don't like that partisanship, they'll begin to drop it. And indeed, I think there are some signs that that's beginning to happen. I do think that cynicism is the great enemy of democracy. And to the extent that people really become cynical, they turn off the system. They don't vote, they don't participate. And the antidote to cynicism is involvement. I don't know of people who are heavily involved in their communities, who are trying to have a better school board, or trying to fix a railroad crossing or trying to build a bridge or whatever, who are really cynical. The more they become involved in the process, the more they're a part of it, the more they support the process.
And is that, I know you speak to a lot of student groups and so forth, and speak on campuses. Is that basically your message to them, or what is your message to young people?
Well, I like, of course, to talk about public service because I think it can be a very stimulating and lively and rewarding career. So I mention what public service did for me. A graduate of a college, DePaul University, didn't have the slightest idea what I wanted to do. I could easily have drifted away, decided to go into the law and then eventually into public service, and public service became my life. And I think it has been a very rewarding one for me, and I think it can be for them. They can see the sheer challenge of it. How do you make this country work? This country is very hard to govern, and it needs people of goodwill who are willing to work for the common good. I know it's not very fashionable to speak these days about the common good, but I think it's right at the core of what the Founding Fathers wanted us to do.
You were chair of the Iran-Contra committee that investigated that matter. What lessons came out of that controversy, that scandal, if you will?
I think one of the big lessons that came out of Iran-Contra was surely that power has to be accountable. That in our system of government, if you put power anywhere, you had better make sure that that power is accountable. And so it renewed my faith, if you would, in transparency and accountability in our system. And I believe in Watergate and in Iran-Contra and in all of these other crises of government that we have had. We've struggled through them. We have all had our doubts about the system as we've gone through those passages, but I have come out of them at least with a confidence that our system works. It doesn't always work immediately, doesn't always work exactly as I'd want it to work, but it basically fundamentally works and lets us live together as a people peacefully and productively, and in an atmosphere of freedom. And that's terribly important for the success of the country.
You were vice chair of the 9/11 Commission, and I read recently where you were conducting a scorecard of what the country has done since your initial report. How is the country doing since your investigation, and what talk a little bit about that whole experience, the 9/11 investigation.
I think the 9/11 Commission was the most successful commission in the history of the country. I suppose that's self-serving to say so, but we have seen a remarkable response in the country, in the government, to what we did. We were charged with two responsibilities: to tell the story of 9/11. People wanted to know what happened. And I think we have written, at least for the immediate future, the definitive history of what happened that day, that terrible day. Secondly, we were asked to make recommendations. We've made a lot of recommendations. Many of them, in really an astounding way, were immediately accepted within a matter of weeks by the President, by the Congress. So we've restructured, for example, the entire intelligence community, all kinds of changes in the FBI, and many, many other changes. At the same time, a lot of our recommendations have been ignored, and we're still plugging away trying to get some of those recommendations approved.
Why do you think they're being ignored? Just politics?
I think they're being ignored for a lot of reasons. Some of it is politics. We said, for example, that money for Homeland Security should be distributed on the basis of the risk and the vulnerability, not as politics as usual. We're going to win that battle. eventually. We haven't won it yet, but I think Homeland Security money will be distributed within the next year or two on the basis of the assessment of the risk. We are arguing for devoting some of the radio spectrum to the first responders so that when they arrive on the scene of the accident or the disaster, as in New York City, they're able to communicate with one another. It's been 4 years now since 9/11. We still haven't solved that problem. We will solve it, and I think we're going to win that one in the next few years. So some of these things are moving in the right direction, and some of them are not. We recommended that the Congress develop a much more robust oversight of the intelligence community. They have not done that, and I don't see any immediate sign that they're going to do it. We think they should do it.
Why did Lee Hamilton never run for president? In 1987, I remember there was quite a bit of discussion and encouragement, at least among opinion leaders, that this was a field that would have been enhanced by your presence. Why did you decide in the end not to make the run?
I guess fundamentally I never ran for president because I really didn't have the fire in the belly, as the politicians say, to do it. I was very pleased with what I was doing. I knew something of the tremendous effort that had to be made to run for president, and a principal deterrent for me was money. I was never very good at raising money in politics. I always had to work very hard at it. Never did it very well. And I knew that the core of running for president was raising an awful lot of money.
Indiana, of course, was well represented on the 9/11 Commission with you and Tim Romer, and it seems to have produced more than its share of thoughtful senators and members of Congress, Birch Bayh, of course, Dick Lugar on the Republican side. Is there something about the Hoosier spirit that has done? Is this just coincidence of this time, or do you think that there's something in your background growing up in Indiana that others that produce these kinds of thoughtful public servants?
I'm often amused by the way Indiana is caricatured in the news and in the news media. A bunch of country bumpkins, cracker barrel philosophers, very rustic state, not very sophisticated, certainly not plugged into the world. I just flat out don't agree with that at all. I think there's an enormous stability in Indiana. Hoosiers are terrific people, lack of pretense, down to earth, very solid people. One of the things that impressed me again and again in the Congress is I'd leave Washington red hot, boiling in politics and policy questions, and you'd fly out to Indiana and you'd land, and it's like a different world out there. Very stable, very good people, very decent, very patriotic people, and it was a good antidote for me. But I've always had a fundamental respect for Hoosiers, largely, I guess, because they're very, very good to me. I won 34 elections, didn't lose any. And I think part of it was because I had a lot of respect for Hoosiers. And I hope in part that respect was returned.
You mentioned Lincoln as somebody that you've been reading recently. Who were some of the people that influenced your philosophical thought, both early on and today? You obviously continue to read.
My favorite period of American history, we all have our favorite periods, but I'm in the school that looks to the Founding Fathers. And I read a lot of the biographies of Franklin and Jefferson and Madison and Washington and all of the other great figures of that day. It's an amazing figure to me. A country of only, whatever it was, 4 or 5 million people at that time. But you had all of this flowering of political genius. And I'm fascinated by that period. So my intellectual ancestors, in a political sense, really come from the founding fathers of this country. One of my favorites is a person not generally put on the list, and that's James Madison. And I often wonder whether a James Madison could ever be elected to the United States Congress today, and I think the answer is he could not. A very small man, very poor speaker. He'd look awful on television. I just don't think the American people would elect him today. But he just happened to be a political genius, and of course was the principal legislator who put together the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
We live in...
Why don't you take a little sip of water? You sound like you're
Getting a little hoarse?
Yes, sir.
we got a couple more questions.
Okay.
We live in precarious times, and you've studied this firsthand through the 9/11 Commission. What does America need to do to continue to be strong and continue? There's a lot of debate that between some schools that believe that America needs to be sort of unilateral in its approach, and others more international. What's your view? How are we going to deal with this sort of international threat, if you will, by some of these terrorist groups?
What impresses me with dealing with almost any international problem is we can't do it by ourselves. As rich as we are, as powerful as we are, as smart as we are, we need help. How can you possibly deal with international terrorism without cooperating? How do you cut off funding for terrorists if you don't deal with the Saudi bankers? How do you stop the proliferation of weapons unless you deal with the loose nukes in Russia and the nuclear weapons elsewhere? How do you have safe international air travel unless you deal with the international airlines? Any problem you mentioned today, environmental problem, health problem, proliferation problems, economic problems, you come to the conclusion that you have to work together with other nations. Now, America has to lead. We're without doubt, the most powerful nation. So I don't argue against American leadership. I just think American has to work with other countries in order to achieve its goals. If you go back to the period after World War II, America led after World War II not by going out on its own. America led by working with the other countries in what we called during that period collective security. The same is true today. We are the leader of the world, but we have to work with other nations, and we cannot do it by ourselves.
Anything else you want to add?
I've told you everything I know.